I remember the bleach-white walls of the hospital room glowing under the fluorescent lights, making everything look stark and unforgiving. It felt as though the walls were pressing in on me, reminding me of my isolation and helplessness, especially on the day my mother and her new husband, my stepfather, decided to leave on a tropical getaway. I was 17, newly returned from a deployment program for underage cadets, part of a special training initiative I'd been selected for, and I was suffering the after-effects of the intense physical and mental challenges I'd endured overseas. My body was weak, my mind was reeling, and I needed guidance, care, and most of all, signatures for my follow-up treatments, because, legally, I was still a minor. What made matters worse, my mother and stepfather had recently married. She'd met him a year and a half earlier at a business conference in another state, and everything had moved so quickly. Within a couple of months, he was in our home, dragging suitcases into the hallway, claiming he would be the strong father figure I never had. Back then, I was still overseas for training, but the rare times I came home, I found our living room transformed, my bedroom repainted, and my mother's face glowing with the excitement of what she insisted was a fresh start for both of us. The day they told me about the honeymoon-like vacation, it hadn't registered that they'd picked the exact same week I was scheduled for a major follow-up at the hospital, and by the time I realized it, flights and hotel reservations were already booked. Standing by my hospital bed, I watched my mother place a few personal items by my side: a half-empty water bottle, a cheap stuffed bear from the hospital gift shop, and the remains of last night's dinner in a takeout box. "We'll be back in a week," she said, not meeting my eyes. Her voice wavered, a hint of uncertainty hidden beneath a bright, forced smile. My stepfather, on the other hand, wore a grin that looked perpetually smug, as if he believed any protest I'd make was insignificant. "You're a soldier now," he remarked, "so you can handle being alone for a bit, can't you?" Those words, laced with condescension, stung my already fragile psyche. My mother offered a feeble wave goodbye, tapping her phone to signal she'd be just a call away. Then, in a rustle of luggage wheels on the tile floor, they were gone, leaving behind the scent of my mother's floral perfume and the echo of footsteps disappearing down the corridor. The next day, I learned the stark reality: no signatures, no treatments. The hospital, despite doctors' compassion, required parental or guardian consent for anything beyond basic care. My condition wasn't life-threatening at that second, but the truth was that every day I delayed my follow-up therapy, the higher the risk of lasting complications. My calls to my mother's cell went straight to voicemail, the ring echoing mockingly before transferring to a pre-recorded message about not being available. My stepfather's phone was no different. I fired off frantic text messages. "Mom, they won't treat me without your signature. Please call back." Nothing. The desperation grew heavier with each unanswered call, each ticking second on the hospital clock, reminding me of how deserted I was. Nurses passed by, pitying glances in their eyes. A well-meaning social worker from the hospital approached me, gently explaining that she could only do so much, and that maybe I should consider contacting Child Protective Services if I was truly left alone. I balked at the idea initially. Reporting my own mother felt like an unspeakable betrayal. But as day turned to night, and my condition worsened from the anxiety and the lack of proper medication, I realized I had no choice. So I called Child Protective Services. My hands shook, my voice cracked, and in the hush of a hospital night, punctuated by the distant hum of overhead lights and the beep of medical monitors, I told them how my mother and stepfather had literally abandoned me at the hospital, flying to some beach resort for a once-in-a-lifetime trip. When I hung up, a strange mixture of guilt and relief gripped me. The guilt for betraying my mother, the relief that maybe I'd finally done something to help myself. The next few days were a blur. CPS workers visited, frowning at paperwork and shaking their heads. They got in touch with the hospital administration, verifying the records, reading my file, and confirming that my mother had indeed left while I was still underage and in need of consent for medical treatment. My phone, silent for days, began to light up. The call started around noon the following Thursday. First it was from a friend of the family, Connie, who left a voice message. "Sweetie, your mother is furious. She's on her way back. What did you do?" Then my phone buzzed again, an unknown number, which I recognized as an out-of-state area code. I didn't answer. 2 days later, my mother and stepfather burst through the hospital doors. By then, I'd been allowed a limited set of follow-up treatments under a special emergency authorization, courtesy of the CPS intervention. The moment they saw me in that hospital bed, eyes sunken, body frail, you'd think they'd be relieved. Instead, their expressions were stormy, especially my stepfather's, who marched over, jabbed a finger toward my face, and demanded to know why I'd thrown them under the bus. My mother stood behind him, wringing her hands, but not saying much. She simply glared at me with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "You made us look like irresponsible parents," my stepfather snarled, voice bouncing against the sterile walls. "We had to cut our vacation short, and for what? You could have just waited." I couldn't speak at first. My heart pounded in my chest. My breath came in short, painful bursts. Finally, my voice erupted, a shaky whisper made hoarse from days of stress. "I needed you, I managed. You left me. I had no choice." My mother, looking torn but leaning heavily under my stepfather's influence, snapped at me. "You're exaggerating. We told you it'd only be a few days. You're not a child anymore. You've been overseas. You can handle more than this." I stared at them, the two of them so unified in their indignation that they barely registered my physical agony or the very real predicament I'd been in. The wave of betrayal that washed over me in that moment was almost too immense to express. I choked back tears, ignoring the throbbing pain in my side, swallowing the bitter truth that I no longer recognized my own mother. My hospital stay extended for another week as I underwent more scans and therapy. During that week, my mother and stepfather visited sporadically, scowling at me as though I'd personally orchestrated some elaborate sabotage to ruin their precious vacation. The hostility was palpable. Nurses noticed. Doctors noticed. Everyone tiptoed around us, as if we were a ticking time bomb. And once the treatment was done, and I had clearance to be discharged, the tension followed us home, into the driveway, past the front door, and into every corner of our house. I had nowhere else to go, so I lived under the same roof as them, enduring biting remarks, constant criticisms, and the weight of an unspoken resentment. Family get-togethers became war zones. Aunts and uncles on my mother's side questioned me. "Why'd you have to call CPS? Couldn't you just wait?" My father's relatives, more distant but still caring, called occasionally to check in, offering a different perspective. "We can't believe they left you alone at a hospital. That's unthinkable." Soon, lines were drawn. Half the family believed I'd ruined my mother's once-in-a-lifetime trip, accusing me of being dramatic. The other half, outraged by the neglect I'd experienced, rallied behind me, promising me that I wasn't to blame. This family divide cast a dreary shadow over everything. I couldn't attend a single gathering without noticing the anger simmering under forced smiles. Holidays felt tense, as if I were walking on glass shards. And whenever my stepfather looked at me, I saw scorn and blame burning in his eyes. Some nights, I lay in bed replaying the events in my mind, my pulse thrumming with anger. I replayed how they just marched away, how the echo of my mother's heels on the hospital tiles had signaled my abandonment. I wanted them to understand the pain they'd caused me, not just physically, but emotionally. I wanted them to grasp that each refusal to pick up the phone was like a hammer blow to my sense of safety, that each day without signature for my treatments was a form of betrayal. In time, I realized that the apology I craved would likely never come. That understanding was what fed the seeds of revenge growing inside me, seeds that I never dreamed I'd harbor. I'd always been taught to be patient, to forgive, and to show empathy, especially given my military-esque upbringing. But the betrayal and subsequent fury from my own mother and stepfather pushed me to a point of darkness I didn't know I possessed. A few months later, the revenge story began to take shape. I was recovering, slowly regaining strength. The doctors prescribed me a strict regimen of physical therapy, medication, and mental health support. I complied, going faithfully to the hospital for sessions, my new social worker friend checking in occasionally to make sure I was okay. During that period, I discovered my stepfather had certain secrets. His quick temper and manipulative behavior were only part of the puzzle. Something told me there was more beneath his slick smile and expensive suits. He worked as a financial consultant, going from meeting to meeting, boasting about how he was raking it in with wealthy clients. My mother, enamored with the lifestyle, bragged about the lavish dinners, the potential real estate deals, and the international conferences they would attend together. But behind that facade, I saw the cracks. I overheard hushed phone calls, glimpsed the anxious tapping of a foot whenever certain letters arrived in the mail. I caught pieces of conversations about lost paperwork, unauthorized funds, and offshore accounts. It was an early Saturday morning, the sun barely cresting over the horizon, when I got up for a glass of water and heard my stepfather arguing loudly on the phone. I froze near the kitchen door, my bare feet cold on the tiles, quietly listening. The conversation was about money, about shifting sums between accounts, about certain records being carefully doctored so that no one would notice. Fear and excitement coursed through me. I sensed something illegal, something that could blow up in his face. Part of me wanted to walk away, to remain ignorant, but a bigger part of me recognized an opportunity. I thought, if he had done something unlawful, it could be the key to forcing him, and maybe even my mother, to confront their wrongdoing. If I reported him, maybe the authorities would question him about his sense of family responsibility, about the child he had neglected. Maybe, in the end, that would give me the closure I'd been craving. I started paying close attention. Over the weeks, I quietly observed the statements that arrived in the mail, noticing suspicious-looking charges, weird corporate addresses in far-off countries, and vague descriptions for consultant fees. Whenever I could, I snapped pictures with my phone. Late at night, I'd go to the living room and open his laptop if he left it around, photographing the financial spreadsheets that popped up. I felt guilty, sneaky, and yet also strangely justified. Hadn't he essentially abandoned me in my most vulnerable hour? Maybe I was just leveling the playing field. My plan was simple: collect proof of his questionable dealings, store it, and wait for the right moment. My chance arrived sooner than expected. One evening, my mother and stepfather had gone out to a local charity gala, one of those events where everyone dresses up fancy and pretends to care deeply about philanthropic causes. I stayed home, feigning fatigue, grateful for the solitude. As I sat in the living room, organizing the documents I had gathered, a text message came through from my social worker friend Alicia. She was checking in as usual, and I found myself typing a quick message back. There's something I need to discuss with you, something that might relate to my stepfather's financial situation. We arranged to meet at her office the next day. The following morning, I showed her everything: the bank statements, the photographs of suspicious files on his laptop, the notes I'd taken documenting snippets of phone calls. Alicia's eyes widened, her brow creasing with concern. "This is serious, Emily," she whispered, using my real name in that compassionate tone that social workers have. "If he's laundering money or embezzling from clients, this could get him into a lot of legal trouble." Alicia was bound by certain protocols, so we carefully decided how to proceed. She guided me to contact a financial crimes hotline and present the evidence anonymously. Initially, I hesitated. Turning in my mother's husband felt like crossing a line of no return. But then I remember the hospital bed, the sleepless nights, and the cruel accusations. The line had already been crossed by him, and possibly by my mother too. I made the call that afternoon. My heart pounded, so loud I could hardly hear the operator on the other end. Using a disguised voice and a burner phone, I reported the suspicious activity, citing exact account numbers, email addresses, and examples of funneling funds. As I spoke, I felt a thrill of righteous anger surge through me. I wasn't just a helpless teenager anymore. I was actively, methodically setting in motion a chain of events that might bring justice, or at least consequences, to the man who had disrespected me so callously. Weeks passed, and nothing seemed to happen. My stepfather continued bragging about his successes, while my mother seemed blissfully unaware, showering him with affection as if nothing were wrong. I wondered if perhaps I'd made a mistake, or if the tip line dismissed my claims as baseless. Then, near the end of summer, I noticed unmarked cars parked outside our house more frequently, sometimes on the corner, sometimes across the street. Men in plain clothes seemed to watch our driveway, though they tried to appear inconspicuous. An uneasy tension filled the house. My stepfather grew irritable, snapping at my mother for minor issues, complaining that certain clients weren't returning calls, that his business partners were all getting jumpy for no reason. My mother went from smiling all the time to furrowing her brow and demanding to know, "What's going on?" But the more she pressed him, the more suspicious and cagey he became. Finally, one quiet morning, I was in the kitchen making myself coffee when I heard a thunderous knock at the front door. Through the window, I saw a group of men in suits, holding badges. Time seemed to slow. My stepfather was still upstairs, my mother in the shower. I approached the door carefully, opening it a crack. One man introduced himself as a federal investigator, quietly asking if my stepfather was home. I nodded, stepping aside, heart hammering, adrenaline pumping. Within minutes, our living room was swarming with agents. They ushered my stepfather downstairs, read him his rights, and began seizing documents, laptops, and USB drives. My mother, wrapped in a robe and her hair dripping water, stood off to the side, panic etched on her face. She kept looking back and forth between the men, confusion twisting her features. "This must be a misunderstanding," she said, voice quivering. "My husband would never," but the words died in her throat as they showed her official warrants and a stack of evidence. I watched from a corner, quietly trembling. This was it, the culmination of my silent, methodical plan. A small, vindictive spark lit in my chest, remembering how helpless and overlooked I'd felt in that hospital. On some level, I wondered if this was the moment he'd realize that ignoring me, belittling me, and leaving me in a dire state had consequences. My mother, though, guilt gnawed at me when I saw her terrified eyes. But then I recalled the accusations she'd hurled at me, the way she'd sided with him so vehemently. I swallowed the regret. This was a road we'd all walked down together, albeit in different ways. They led my stepfather out in handcuffs. Cameras from nearby houses clicked, neighbors peeking through their windows. My mother collapsed onto the couch, crying, demanding to speak with a lawyer. Over the next few days, I watched her unravel, frantic phone calls to attorneys, heated discussions with extended family members. The once cocky stepfather was behind bars, awaiting charges of fraud, money laundering, and more. As the dust settled, my mother looked at me differently. The initial shock and terror morphed into suspicion, as if she sensed I might have had a hand in toppling her husband's empire. It wasn't immediate or obvious, but her gaze lingered on me when she thought I wasn't looking. She never said it out loud, not then anyway, but the tension between us became an unspoken confirmation of the truth. I was responsible, and in her eyes, I dealt a devastating blow to her newlywed life. "Why would you do this?" she finally asked one evening, voice hollow, tears staining her cheeks. We were alone in the living room, the hush of the house broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. "Do you hate me that much?" I didn't answer right away. The pain in my chest felt suffocating. I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm. Finally, I whispered, "You left me alone, Mom. You and him both. I could have died in that hospital bed. You both acted like it was no big deal. Calling CPS was me asking for help, and you two punished me for it. I guess I just wanted you to see that your actions have consequences." Her eyes flickered with a storm of emotions, anger, guilt, sorrow, confusion. But she didn't speak another word. She simply stood up, walked upstairs, and closed her bedroom door behind her. In the months that followed, investigators built their case against my stepfather. My mother, despite her earlier illusions, couldn't escape the fact that she too was financially enmeshed in some of his dealings, albeit unknowingly. She found herself tangled in a legal web, questioned by authorities, her finances scrutinized. Our household finances froze, the lavish trips and fancy dinners replaced by phone calls from creditors and legal fees. Through it all, I continued my physical and mental therapy, determined not to let the chaos destroy me. The small but growing part of me that believed I'd done the right thing clung to a sense of moral righteousness, while another part wrestled with the guilt of having torn my mother's life apart. Certain family members, those who'd sided with me earlier, now wondered if I'd gone too far. "He was a jerk, sure, but did you have to ruin him?" they asked. Others praised me quietly. "He deserved what he got. You did the right thing, exposing a criminal." My mother's attitude toward me swung like a pendulum. Some days, she retreated into sullen silence, hardly looking me in the eye. Other days, she launched into fits of fury, accusing me of orchestrating all her misfortunes. The last piece of love or sympathy she had for me seemed overshadowed by the realization that I had been the catalyst for her husband's downfall. Yet, there were nights when she knocked softly on my bedroom door, tears in her voice, asking if we could talk. I let her in, always with my guard up. She'd sit on my bed, eyes rimmed with red, and apologize for leaving me in the hospital. I was stupid, selfish. I thought you'd be fine. I didn't realize how badly you needed me, she confessed, voice trembling. I'm sorry I didn't pick up the phone. I'm sorry I left you to fend for yourself. I was caught up in this fantasy world with him, and I didn't want anything to ruin our vacation. For a moment, I'd see the mother I once adored, the caring figure who used to cradle me when I was sick, read me bedtime stories, and encourage my dreams. I love you, Mom, I'd whisper, fighting back tears. But I'm still so angry, so hurt. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I know, she said, and I don't blame you. Despite those vulnerable moments, the cycle of bitterness and regret continued, overshadowed by legal battles, mounting debts, and the cold specter of jail time for my stepfather. My mother visited him occasionally, although her expressions grew more conflicted with each trip. She saw, perhaps for the first time, the full scope of his deception, the extent to which he'd used her. And in those tearful returns from prison visits, she often locked herself in her room, refusing to speak. A year drifted by, marked by court hearings and stress. I turned 18 during that period, quietly celebrating with a small group of friends who understood my situation. My mother missed the entire birthday dinner, too exhausted from a day spent with lawyers. Life felt bleak and joyless, like we were trudging through a never-ending storm. But ironically, as the criminal case finally wrapped up, a shift began to take place. My stepfather, faced with indisputable evidence and testimony from defrauded clients, pled guilty to several counts of financial misconduct. He received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperating with investigators. On the day of his sentencing, my mother came home pale and trembling, tears glistening in her eyes. I expected her to either lash out at me or sink into a depressive silence, but instead, she sank onto the couch and beckoned me over. I sat beside her, uncertain. I told him I'm filing for divorce, she said softly, voice trembling but resolute. I can't keep pretending he's some misunderstood saint. For the first time in ages, I felt a flicker of relief. The conversation that followed was strained, filled with regrets and revelations. She admitted she'd been seduced by his charm and money, wanting a new life, wanting to forget the hardships of being a single mother, wanting a glamorous existence. She admitted she'd ignored my needs and later convinced herself I was just being dramatic when I called CPS. I see now how wrong it all was, she said, rubbing her eyes wearily. I wish I could go back and change it. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I wish you could too, I whispered. That night, the biggest barrier between us cracked. Neither of us magically forgot the pain, but that raw, honest talk felt like a first step toward something resembling healing. Over the next few weeks, I watched my mother navigate the divorce proceedings, each step an emotional roller coaster. At times, I supported her, reminding her that despite everything, she had worth outside of him, that she could rebuild her life. She, in turn, began to see me as her daughter again, an adult daughter, now, who had fought her own battles. Ironically, it was at a family gathering, a hesitant attempt at normalcy, where I found the next turning point of this revenge tale. My mother and I decided to attend a small barbecue hosted by my aunt, a gentle woman who'd always tried to remain neutral in the whole fiasco. Dozens of relatives filled the backyard, and there was an unmistakable tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting to see how we'd act around each other. Some folks tried to plaster on smiles, offering superficial chit-chat about the weather and the new neighbor's dog. Others gave me side-eye, still blaming me for the drama, or gave my mother pitying glances. Partway through the event, as I was grabbing a cold soda from the cooler, I overheard two of my uncles mocking me, complaining that I'd destroyed the family, and that my stepfather was just trying to make a living like everyone else. Something in me snapped. I marched over, heart pounding, and demanded they say it to my face. A heated exchange followed, voices raised, everyone going silent to watch. My mother came rushing over, her eyes brimming with anxiety. She took my hand, telling me not to cause a scene, that it wasn't worth it. But for the first time, she also defended me. She looked at my uncles, lips set in a trembling line, and said, "You have no idea what really happened. He abandoned her. We abandoned her. She was hospitalized, alone, and we went on a vacation. And guess what? He turned out to be a criminal. Emily may have called CPS, but it was the right thing for her to do. We were in the wrong. I was in the wrong." A hush settled, broken only by the hiss of the barbecue grill. My uncles backed off, exchanging glances, unable to muster a retort. I stood there, stunned. The mother I used to know, the one who'd once been kind and protective, was speaking in my defense. I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. In that moment, my mother squeezed my hand, her own eyes glossing with emotion. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a total fix, but it was a moment of raw honesty that began to bridge the gap between us. In the final aftermath, my stepfather was locked away in a federal correctional facility, serving out his sentence. My mother pushed forward with the divorce, a complicated legal dance requiring her to prove she'd had no knowledge of his crimes. She moved us into a smaller apartment, one we could afford on her own salary, an abrupt change from the big house we'd once shared. Gone were the illusions of wealth and grandeur. Our new place was modest, the living room walls a plain beige, the furniture secondhand. But in that humble space, I found a sense of truth and comfort that had been missing for so long. We didn't speak of revenge anymore. My mother never asked for a full account of how my stepfather's activities had been exposed. Maybe she didn't want to know the specifics. Maybe she suspected but chose to let sleeping dogs lie. What mattered was that we were finally on a path to rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't easy. Some nights, I still dreamed of that hospital bed and the echo of footsteps leaving me behind. Some days, she'd break down, lamenting the life she'd once envisioned for herself, for both of us. But slowly, day by day, we found a new normal. She scheduled therapy sessions for both of us, acknowledging the traumas we'd endured, mine from the hospital ordeal and her emotional damage from a toxic marriage. We'd cook simple meals together, sharing the tasks of chopping vegetables and stirring sauces. Sometimes, we even laughed at small things, like the comedic mishaps of trying new recipes. Those moments of quiet connection felt like water in a desert, a sign that we were both capable of growth. Perhaps the biggest step came when, one day, my mother picked me up from a therapy session and asked if I wanted to visit the hospital where I'd been abandoned. She said she wanted to apologize in person to the staff who'd taken care of me, to the social worker who'd helped me. My chest tightened, memory swirling, but I agreed. We walked through those corridors, the same fluorescent lights reflecting off the white walls, the same bustling nurses and beeping machines. My mother's eyes were moist as she found Alicia, my social worker friend, and thanked her for stepping in when she couldn't. Alicia, surprised but gracious, accepted the apology. Then, as if guided by an invisible thread of closure, my mother turned to me, hugging me softly in the middle of that hallway, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Emily. I should have been there." I felt my anger melt away like ice under a warm sun. Tears slipped down my cheeks, and I hugged her back. "I know," I said simply. "I forgive you." It wasn't an instant cure-all. Wounds as deep as ours take time to fully heal. But in that hospital hallway, we found something precious. A real moment of understanding, free from blame or defensiveness. A sense that, despite everything, our arguments, betrayals, and yes, even my revenge, we still had the chance to mend what was broken. Epilogue, a happy ending in sight. Months later, I stood in a recruitment office, finalizing my paperwork for a more official enlistment in the armed forces once I turned 19. My health had improved dramatically, thanks to diligent therapy and medical follow-ups. My mother, though anxious, supported my choice. She understood that the structure and discipline of the military might be good for me, providing a sense of purpose. We'd come a long way from that dark moment when she and my stepfather abandoned me for a tropical vacation. Our bond, while scarred, was stronger than it had been in years. We spoke openly about the mistakes we'd made, the regrets, and the lessons learned. My mother, newly divorced, was focusing on building a stable life, one founded on honest work and personal accountability. She even started volunteering at a local community center, hoping to help other parents avoid making the same mistakes she'd made. Sometimes, we visited my father's relatives, who were more supportive of me, and we gradually reconnected with certain family members who'd kept their distance. Rebuilding trust with them took time. Some still viewed me through the lens of a dramatic teen who'd called CPS on her own parents, but others came to understand that the real betrayal had come from my mother's and stepfather's negligence. The fractures in the family might never fully vanish, but there was, at least, civil discourse now, an unspoken agreement to let the past lie in the dust and focus on forging a better future. As for my stepfather, I received occasional letters from him in prison. At first, I didn't even open them. But one night, curiosity got the better of me. Inside one envelope was a rambling apology. He claimed to have found religion, realized his wrongdoings, and so on. Part of me scorned the words, recalling how he once sneered at me in the hospital. Another part of me felt a strange pity. I showed the letter to my mother, who read it silently and then placed it aside, deciding not to respond. "He made his choices," she said. "We have to live with ours." I, too, chose not to reply. Perhaps forgiveness might come someday, but I wasn't ready to hand it to him on a silver platter. For now, my focus was on my own future. On a crisp autumn day, just before my official enlistment training was set to begin, my mother and I took a walk around the neighborhood of our new apartment. The leaves were turning red and gold, and the air felt fresh, carrying the scent of upcoming change. She looped her arm through mine as we ambled past rows of houses, talking about everyday things, groceries, how we decorate for the holidays, the neighbor's cat that always meowed outside our window. At one point, she stopped and turned to me, her eyes brimming with sincerity. "I know I can't erase what happened," she said, voice trembling slightly. "But I want you to know you are the most important person in my life. Emily. Nothing matters more than your health, your happiness. I was blind and selfish before, but I see things clearly now." I felt tears threaten to spill from my eyes. A wave of warmth coursed through me. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered, giving her hand a squeeze. I love you." We continued walking, hand in hand, beneath the canopy of autumn leaves swirling in the breeze. It was a small moment, but it symbolized a bigger truth. Out of the pain, betrayal, and yes, a bit of orchestrated revenge, we'd found a path back to each other, forging a bond tempered by hardship but ultimately strengthened by the willingness to change. At the hospital, in that moment of near despair, I had felt utterly alone. Now, as we strolled side by side, I felt something else entirely. Hope. Hope that even the deepest wounds can heal, that families can be salvaged from the wreckage of betrayal, that revenge, while it might bring short-term satisfaction, isn't the end of the story. The end of this tale, at least for me, was discovering that the real, happy ending isn't about triumphing over someone else, but about finding a way to move forward without the weight of anger crushing your spirit. And so, in the fading light of a late autumn afternoon, we walked home together, mother and daughter, forging a brand new bond, forging a future that, though uncertain, felt more honest and more loving than anything we'd shared before.